Welcome to Americana Archives. Travel back in time with us as we go throughout America's historic newspapers to find the lost and forgotten history of America. Today's story comes from the great state of Maine. It's reported in the Portland Daily Press of April 14th, 1888. Today's headline is The Ice Business. The subheadline is some interesting statistics of an important industry. It says, ice and steam were known products of water long years ago, but their practical everyday use for the benefit of mankind has come within the last 50 or 60 years. The poet Horace, writing before the time of Christ's birth, alludes in his odes to wines cooled by ice brought from the frozen streams, and Solomon, in the book of Proverbs, says, as the cold of snow in the time of harvest, so is a faithful messenger to them that send him, for he refresheth the soul of his master. Both quotations show that the ancient use of ice and snow was probably limited to the cooling of wine or other drinks. Until recently, ice has been regarded as a luxury, and many persons, now living, can remember when it was used only by the confectioner, who put up a small quantity for his own use. Now the ice cart is one of the most familiar objects on the street. It was the use of ice by the manufacturing chemist, by the brewer, the fisherman, fish dealer, and dealers in fresh meat, butter, and milk, who could make money by the use of ice to preserve their stock in trade, and who needed a constant and regular supply that established the ice business on a permanent basis, making ice as an antiseptic a necessity to trade, as well as a comfort in our homes. The first person to cut, use, and sell ice in Portland was Mr. David Robinson, and the following facts, incidents, and dates of the early history of the business in Portland were given the writer by Mr. Robinson and his sons. His first ice house or ice cellar was on Munjoy Hill near Neck Pond. He was a confectioner and used the ice in his own business, cutting it from Neck Pond for the first time in 1822 and 1823, and filling a small ice cellar. He made the first ice cream used in Portland and served it at an evening party given by Captain Clapp to General Lafayette at the time of the general's visit to Portland in 1824. The first ice house used by Mr. Robinson for keeping his ice was really a cellar made by excavating and building on the side of Munjoy Hill, a room 8 by 10 feet and 10 feet deep. It was walled up and covered with a low roof, only a little higher than the ground on the backside, while the front on the lower hillside was high enough for a door. The cellar holding from 12 to 14 tons, a year's supply of ice for Portland. 4 or 5 years later, his business having increased, he prepared a place on Cumberland Street between Locust and Smith Streets, which held about 52 tons. This, too, was underground, for at that time it was not thought possible to keep it above ground. This was filled with ice cut from Neck Pond on Munjoy Hill. Mr. Robinson first attempted to sell ice in Portland in the year 1830, and the story as he told it was as follows. He had heard that in New York City, ice was sold and delivered to families during the summer season. So one day, when the weather was extremely warm, he determined to try his luck at selling ice in Portland. Hiring a horse and wagon and taking a small quantity of ice from his Cumberland Street house, he called at the houses of the prominent men to see if their families would like a regular supply of ice during the summer. The only sales he made were to Judge Mellon on State Street, who bought 12.5 cents worth, to a man who bought 6.25 cents worth, that he might be able to tell his friends that he held a piece of hard ice in his hand in July, and 6.25 cents worth to an invalid who thought it would keep his water cool at night. Others thought it was a foolish expenditure of money and wondered what they would do with it. Mr. Robinson was not discouraged, and in a day or two went around again, but this time did not sell a single piece, for even Judge Mellon, having wrapped his carefully in a blanket, had kept it so well he did not need or want more. That closed the ice business for 1830, and for this business venture, his profit and loss account stood as follows. Cash paid for use of horse and wagon, $1.50. Ice sold as above, 25 cents. So the loss on the first year's ice business was $1.25. For some years after this, Mr. Robinson sold a little ice each year and delivered it with a hand cart or wheelbarrow. The first ice house built above ground was on the western side of Center Street near Congress and was built over an ice cellar to increase storage capacity. In 1836 or 1837, the benefit of ice was so well understood, there was business enough for a regular supply of ice in all parts of the city. So Mr. Robinson, taking his son, Mr. R.L. Robinson, into the business, built the ice house, which stood until 1876 on Cumberland Street, near the Casco Street Church. It had a storage capacity of 700 tons, which was afterward enlarged to hold 1,000 tons. In 1851, Mr. Robinson sold the business to Foster and Cartwright, who carried it on till the organization of the Sebago Lake Ice Company, an incorporated stock company with a paid-up cash capital of $25,000. This company organized November 9, 1852, by choice of the following gentlemen on the board of directors: John A. Poor, S. W. Porter, F. A. Cartwright, E. L. Cummings, and A. K. Shirtleff. They intended to do a shipping business. Foster and Cartwright had sold and shipped in 1851 and 1852 about 3,000 tons of ice, and it was the intention of the company to increase this amount. At first, they were very successful. Ice was scarce and high, and the very first year, they sold and shipped 48 cargoes, averaging 153 tons each. They were over-sanguine, and unfortunately did not realize the true condition of things. They made up their accounts in July, valuing the ice on hand and unsold at market price, declared and paid a dividend of 25%, and about a month after declared another dividend of 12.5%, as they never sold the ice valued at the high price of that season. Their dividends were paid from the capital. The next winter was a cold one, with an abundance of ice everywhere, and the profits of the retail business were not enough to cover the expenses of the company, particularly as they had divided not only the profits of their successful year's business, but part of their capital. The expenses of the following year used up nearly all that remained to them, and they were obliged to close the business in the fall of 1855. Since that time, others have been engaged for a longer or shorter time in the ice trade with varying success. But in giving the history of the ice business, it seems best to follow the line of succession. Mr. D.W. Clark bought out and succeeded the Sebago Lake Ice Company in 1855. He harvested their ice for them in 1854, managed the shipping in the summer following, and has continued in the business since that time, a period of over 30 years. The growth of the business has been considerable. In 1855, there were 490 customers. Now there are probably over 3,000. At that time, less than 2,000 tons of ice supplied the retail trade. Now it requires the storage each winter of from 20 to 25,000 tons for the city trade alone. One fact, however, should be remembered. The ice dealer cannot sell more than about one half of what is put up in the winter. It melts and wastes to such a degree that the actual quantity of ice sold in Portland and delivered is not more probably than 12 or 15,000 tons. The history of the shipping business may interest the general reader more than the retail or city trade. Mr. Frederick Tudor of Boston is undoubtedly and justly entitled to the credit of first shipping ice from the north to southern and warmer countries, and the first cargo ever shipped from this country or any other by vessel was loaded in February of 1806 at Praise Wharf in Charlestown, Massachusetts. The ice was cut with saws and axes and taken to the wharf in wagons, and as Mr. Tudor could not find a vessel that was willing to take the risk of carrying ice, he bought one which he loaded for Martinique. The venture was attended with considerable loss, partly with the dismasting of the brig, and partly for want of ice houses at Martinique in which to store and keep the ice. Up to 1812, he had not been successful, and then the embargo interrupted shipments. After the war, however, he commenced shipping to the southern states, not at all discouraged. The growth of the business was very slow. In 1806, Mr. Tudor shipped one cargo of 130 tons. In 1816, or 10 years later, he shipped 6 cargoes of 12,000 tons, and in 1826, or 20 years later, he shipped 15 cargoes or 4,000 tons. His first really successful voyage was in 1825, after which the business increased, till in 1836 others began shipping. In 1834, Mr. Tudor sent the first cargo of ice to the East Indies, and many interesting facts might be told of his experiments to preserve the ice on this voyage. Indeed, it was not till many years of difficulty, discouragement, and heavy loss had passed, that to be succeeded in packing the ice in a ship so as to preserve it and deliver enough at the end of the voyage to make it profitable. One of the most costly of his experiments was wrapping each cake of ice separately in flannel. This did not pay, nor did Mr. Tudor succeed until he adopted the simple plan of making an ice house of his vessel by filling with sawdust on the same principle that ice houses are usually built, namely surrounding the ice with sawdust, placing it beneath, above, and on each side of the ice in mass, sawdust being a non-conductor of heat. Even with the utmost care in loading, the waste during the long voyage was very great, for the vessel crossed the equator twice in going to the East Indies. Mr. Field, Mr. Tudor's son-in-law, in a conversation on the subject, told the writer that when the first cargo sent to the East Indies reached its destination, there were only about 5 tons left unmelted at the end of the voyage. This was not his only trouble, for while the English people in India were rejoiced at the arrival of a cargo of ice and encouraged Mr. Tudor to try again, promising him a monopoly of the business, yet in many places the prejudice was so great that people would not buy it when brought to them for sale, believing it to be unhealthy. It is said that when the first cargo of ice was sent to New Orleans, a mob drove away the workmen and even destroyed the houses prepared for storing the ice when discharged from the vessel, till unable to land her cargo, she had to leave New Orleans and go to Cuba. The first ice shipped from Portland was in 1839. Then Mr. David Robinson sold a small cargo to go to Philadelphia. The ice for the purpose was cut on Capissac Pond and taken on sleds to the wharf at the Stroudwater Bridge and shipped there. In the winter of 1842, Mr. Earl Carpenter, an ice dealer of Providence, Rhode Island, cut and shipped a number of cargoes from Capissac Pond for his own use in his retail trade at Providence, Rhode Island. The same year, parties from Boston, probably Mr. Tudor, cut ice at Duck Pond, Westbrook, hauling it into the city at great expense by ox teams furnished by the farmers. We have found no record of other shipments of ice from Portland, although there may be some, until 1851, when Foster and Cartwright, and after them the Sebago Lake Ice Company, cut ice from the Canal Basin, Libby's Corner, shipping in the 5 years from 1851 to 1856 104 cargoes of ice, or 17,483 tons. From 1856 to 1873, only about 30 cargoes of ice, or 5,908 tons, were sent from Portland. In the year 1855, at the time of the Crimean War, the ship City of Montreal was loaded with 1,172 tons of ice at Sturtevant's Wharf on account of A. Shaw and others of Montreal. The ship cleared for Liverpool, and her cargo was sold at a handsome figure to the English government and sent to the Crimea for the use of the hospital service. The opening of the Portland and Ogdenburg Railroad offered better facilities for hauling large quantities of ice than could be done with teams, and in 1873, the firm of D.W. Clark and Company, consisting of Mr. D.W. Clark and Mr. Ashbel Chaplin, conceived the idea of increasing their business by building ice houses at Sebago Lake and bringing the ice by the P&O Railroad to Tidewater for shipment. This plan they carried out and began shipping ice early in the spring of 1874. The business increasing, in 1880, they built the house at Barberry Creek, Cape Elizabeth, with a storage capacity of about 40,000 tons. In 1882, the Clark and Chaplin Ice Company was formed under the general law of the state of Maine, and the business extended by enlarging their storage capacity until now their ice houses, situated at Sebago Lake and Cape Elizabeth, also at Bowdoinham and Pittston on the Kennebec River, have a storage capacity of about 200,000 tons. The increasing demand for ice is not alone from the increase of the population, but rather from the chemical and antiseptic uses to which it is put. This demand, which has grown up largely during the last 25 or 30 years, together with the frequent failure of the crops south, turned the attention of ice dealers to the state of Maine. When the thermal line runs during the winter months north of the Hudson River, from which New York City and Brooklyn and other cities in that vicinity obtain most of their supply of 3 million tons annually, and they come to the state of Maine for ice, the demand is very great. The crop in our own state has never failed, and Sebago Lake alone could furnish enough for all. The winter of 1862 and 1863 was warm. Mr. J.L. Cheeseman, who had cut ice on the Hudson River, finding the ice crop was likely to fail in that locality, came from New York to Portland looking for a place for cutting and shipping ice. Mr. Clark recommended the Kennebec River, and Mr. Cheeseman commenced operations immediately, building houses, then cutting and putting up the ice to ship during the summer of 1863. The advantages of the location induced them to continue in the business and led them to commence building. Until now, there are about 50 ice houses on the Kennebec River, with a storage capacity of over 1 million tons of ice. A new and unexpected turn of this ice trade developed in the summer of 1878. The ice crop was short in the west, and ice was sent by rail from the state of Maine as far west as Chicago and St. Louis. 3,000 tons of our Sebago Lake ice went by rail to Chicago, Cincinnati, and other western cities. The price of ice is, like other articles of commerce, regulated by the supply and demand, but the supply is controlled by the winter weather, so that the thermal line at which ice of sufficient thickness to cut, making in the rivers and ponds, indicates what the price will be the following summer. When it's a warm winter and but little or no ice is made on the Hudson River, and New York City comes down east to the state of Maine for a supply, the price must necessarily advance, and the ice dealers and shippers of our state have the benefit. It's possible, owing to the greater purity of the ice cut in Maine over that cut from the Hudson River, and that even more Maine ice may be required and the shipment to New York become more regular and permanent. Dr. Mitchell Pruden has shown that the water of the Hudson River is very impure and suggested that the State Board of Health should begin a vigorous inspection of the ice cut from the river. Philadelphia has abandoned the Schuylkill, and it may be possible that New York will virtually abandon the Hudson. Should that time ever come, ice property in the state of Maine would become very valuable. The record of the shipment for the last 35 years develops an interesting fact and will show how the carrying capacity of coasting vessels has increased. Ice is always shipped in full cargoes. In the year 1851, the largest cargo of ice loaded from this point was the brig Shamrock, 255.5 tons. In 1852, the ship Williams, 331 tons. In 1853, out of 49 vessels loaded, the largest cargo was the Nat Blake of 315 tons. Most of these years, from 1851 to 1880, are the years of largest shipments from this port, but show conclusively the increase in the size of vessels that has been going on, especially during the last decade. At the present time, there are a large number of vessels in the coasting trade that carry from 1,000 to 2,000 tons of ice for a cargo. The ice business has increased very rapidly and is growing every year. We have it on good authority that there are now more than 10,000 individuals, firms, and incorporated companies engaged in carrying on the ice business in the United States. During the winter months, the cutting, storing, and occasional shipping of ice from the water gives employment to about 600,000 men at a time of the year when there is but little employment to be obtained, and the amount paid annually to these men is probably over $30 million. The capital invested in ice houses, land, and ice privileges, tools, machinery, and the manufacture of tools and material employed in the business is about $40 million. The storage capacity of the ice houses in the United States is over 30 million tons of ice. The waste of this ice is full 40%. Some dealers consider it 50%, but probably there are now sold over 20 million tons of ice annually in these United States. The ice dealer of today is able by the means of machinery to handle large quantities of ice very rapidly. An endless chain run by steam power will lift 3,000 to 4,000 tons of ice out of the water and elevate it to the ice house in a day. The larger companies now use an ice plane that takes from the top of every cake of ice as it goes up on this elevator all the dirt and snow ice, cleaning and cutting off everything down to the hard solid ice before it is packed away in the house for summer use. Other improvements have been made in the machinery and tools for cutting, handling, and loading the ice, so that it is not now at all uncommon for a crew of men to take out of the ice house and place on board a vessel 600 tons in a day, or 1 ton a minute for the working day. The money returned for the ice ships south is so much clear gain to the prosperity of the state, and is used to pay for labor in the winter season while cutting, and in the summer season while loading and shipping. Ice has its medicinal uses and is a tonic which produces no injurious reaction. Its refrigerating power preserves and renders most articles of food and drink more palatable. By its antiseptic powers, fresh meat and other perishable articles are preserved, so that by means of the refrigerator car, fresh meat, fruit, and vegetables can be brought from long distances to market, thus reducing the price to the consumer, and fresh fish from the ocean are carried far inland to market. The large quantity of ice shipped south to the coal ports has also a tendency to reduce the price of coal, for vessels from the coal ports can and will bring coal for less freight if they could be sure of a return cargo of ice. Then it may be said we are warmed as well as cooled by ice. In closing, we would say that experiments are being made and a method of cooling may be discovered by the chemist that shall make larger quantities of ice useless. But up to the present time, we know of no better way than to store the ice in the cold days of winter, that it may be ready for our use and comfort when the thermometer touches the 90s next July. This article was written by the reporter WCD. There's an asterisk at the end of this article telling us that Capissic Pond is a mill pond in the town of Deering, conveyed by Indian deed to Francis Small on July 27, 1857. The condition or consideration was one trading coat a year. Thank you for joining us today. Remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.